The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble hallway. Sandra Martinez stood motionless, her hand trembling as she held her daughter's small fingers. Emma, just 3 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that once sparkled with the kind of innocent joy only children possess, now looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and imperfectly repaired. Those eyes, once full of curiosity and wonder, were now hollow, distant, as if they belonged to someone much older, someone who had already witnessed too much of the world's cruelty. Sandra's throat tightened as she watched her daughter. Emma wore a pink dress, the one she used to love, the one with the little embroidered flowers that she would twirl in whenever they danced in the living room. But there was no twirling today. There hadn't been dancing in 6 months. In fact, there hadn't been much of anything resembling joy in 6 months. The courthouse hallway was bustling with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past them, their voices clipped and professional, their minds occupied with other people's tragedies, other people's shattered lives. A court clerk wheeled a cart laden with files. Security guards stood at their posts, their expressions unchanging and unmoved by the human drama playing out around them. It was just another Tuesday for them. But for Sandra, it was the most important day of her life. For Emma, it was another terrifying threshold to cross. Sandra squeezed her daughter's hand gently, trying to convey without words, "Mommy is here. Mommy will protect you." But she wasn't sure Emma could feel it anymore. She wasn't sure her daughter could feel anything anymore except fear. It had started 6 months ago, 6 months that felt like 6 years, like an eternity of slow-motion suffering. Sandra remembered the day Emma came back from her first unsupervised overnight visit with her father. Emma's face had been strange that morning, her usual chattering silenced. She hadn't asked for her favorite breakfast or sung the little song she loved. Instead, she'd clung to Sandra, her small fingers gripping her mother's shirt like a lifeline. "Did you have fun with Daddy?" Sandra had asked, trying to sound casual, though her mother's instinct was already screaming something was wrong. Emma hadn't answered. She'd just shaken her head and buried her face in Sandra's neck. That was the beginning. After that, the changes had accelerated like a sickness, spreading through her daughter's small body and developing mind. Emma began having nightmares, terrible bone-chilling nightmares that would jolt her awake in the dead of night, her small body drenched in sweat, her voice raw from screaming. Sandra would rush into her room and find her daughter sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide and unseeing, trapped in some inner hell that her 3-year-old mind couldn't articulate and her mother couldn't access. "Mommy, make it stop," Emma would cry, but when Sandra asked what it was, Emma would go silent, her lips sealed shut as if by some invisible force. The behavioral changes had. Emma, who had always been a social butterfly, suddenly became withdrawn. Her teachers reported that she no longer participated in group activities. She sat alone during circle time. She didn't raise her hand or sing songs or play with the other children. She just existed in some gray space, watching the world through thick panes of glass that no one could break through. Sandra had taken her to Dr., a child psychologist with 20 years of experience. The doctor had examined Emma with a gentle touch and kinder eyes, asking questions that Emma wouldn't answer. She'd drawn pictures, blank papers that Emma stared at but never marked. She'd played with dolls and toys, and Emma had watched but not participated. After 3 sessions, Doctor had called Sandra into her office and delivered the words that every mother dreads. "Emma exhibits every behavioral marker of childhood trauma. Something has happened to her, Sandra. Something significant." Sandra had felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The custody battle that followed had been a nightmare within the nightmare. Her ex-husband, everything. He hired expensive lawyers who tore Sandra's credibility apart, suggesting she was a vindictive ex-wife trying to manipulate the court system for her own advantage. They questioned whether Emma's symptoms could be attributed to something else: anxiety, adjustment issues from the divorce, an overprotective mother's imagination. But Sandra knew. every fiber of her being knew. She could see it in the way Emma flinched when a man raised his voice. She could see it in the way her daughter would retreat to the bathroom and lock the door, sitting in complete darkness for hours. She could see it in the way Emma's body seemed to reject physical touch. Even hugs from Sandra were met with stiffness, with resistance. The court system, however, operated on evidence and testimony, not on a mother's desperate certainty. And Emma, traumatized, terrified Emma, would not speak. She would not say what happened. She would not name the horror that had stolen her childhood. Judge Harrison, a 60-year-old man with tired eyes and a dwindling patience for what she said cases, had become increasingly frustrated. Without Emma's testimony, without concrete evidence, his hands were tied. The psychological evaluations, while concerning, weren't legally conclusive. The allegations, while serious, were unsubstantiated by the child's own words. "Your Honor," his lawyer had argued just last week, "we have only a mother's claims and a child's silence. In the American legal system, silence is not guilt." Sandra had wanted to scream. She had wanted to grab the lawyer by the collar and shake him, to make him understand that Emma's silence wasn't the absence of truth, it was the presence of terror. It was trauma speaking louder than words ever could. But she couldn't do that. She had to sit quietly, maintain her composure, be the perfect plaintiff in a system that was failing her daughter. Now standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, Sandra felt the weight of everything. The uncertainty, the fear, the desperate hope that today would be different. She looked down at Emma, who was swinging her feet slightly, her expression blank. "We're going to go inside soon, baby," Sandra said softly, kneeling down to eye level with her daughter. "And the judge is going to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but if you can, it would really help Mommy." Emma blinked slowly, her dark eyes meeting her mother's for just a moment before looking away. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison sat at his bench, reviewing files. The father's lawyer was already there, confident and composed. Sandra's attorney, Michael, stood near the defense table, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his briefcase. Everyone was in position. Everyone was ready for another round of legal battle, another hearing that might solve nothing. Emma squeezed her mother's hand as they approached the courtroom doors. Today everything would change, but none of them knew it yet. The courtroom was cold and sterile, with its high ceilings and polished wood panels that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on everyone present. The gallery behind the wooden railing held a handful of spectators, a court-appointed social worker, a victim's advocate who had been helping Sandra navigate this nightmare, and a few curious observers who had nothing better to do than watch other people's suffering unfold like a drama on stage. Emma sat at the table with her mother, swinging her legs nervously. Her small frame seemed to shrink further with each passing moment. She wouldn't look at her father, who sat across the room with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Thornton who had built her reputation on dismantling claims like the one Sandra was making. Judge Harrison, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tired expression that comes from decades of sitting in judgment, adjusted his glasses and looked toward the prosecution table. "Mister, I'm ready to hear from your expert witness." Michael stood, his 6-foot frame somehow seeming smaller in the vast courtroom. He'd been working this case for 4 months, and the toll was evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Your Honor, I called Doctor to the stand." Doctor emerged from the side door, a woman in her mid-50s with gentle features and kind eyes that had seen countless traumatized children. She was sworn in, placed her hand on the Bible, and sat in the witness box. There was a presence about her, a quiet authority that came from genuine expertise and compassionate experience. Michael approached her with a stack of documents. "Doctor, you've examined the minor, Emma Martinez, on 3 separate occasions, correct?" Yes, that's correct, Doctor replied, her voice steady and professional. And in your professional opinion as a child psychologist with over 2 decades of experience, what were your findings? Doctor took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Emma exhibits a constellation of behavioral and psychological markers that are consistent with childhood trauma. She demonstrates signs of complex PTSD, including hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, sleep disturbances, and significant attachment anxiety. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sandra felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. Can you elaborate on what these symptoms mean in layman's terms? Michael asked. Certainly. Emma is in a constant state of heightened alert. Her nervous system is essentially stuck in fight or flight mode. She startles easily, she's overly attuned to potential threats, and she struggles to regulate her emotions in appropriate ways. Her sleep is severely disrupted by nightmares, and she has extreme difficulty with trust and physical contact, even with her primary caregiver, her mother. Judge Harrison was taking notes, his expression unreadable. Thornton stood for the cross-examination, her heels clicking sharply against the courtroom floor. Doctor, these symptoms you're describing, could they be caused by something other than abuse? They could potentially be caused by other sources of trauma or severe anxiety, Doctor acknowledged. Such as a frightening medical procedure, witnessing violence between the parents, or even significant separation anxiety related to the divorce itself. Thornton pounced on this opening like a predator spotting weakness. So you cannot definitively state that these symptoms indicate abuse by the father. Not from the symptoms alone, no, but taken in context with. A simple yes or no will suffice, Thornton interrupted smoothly. You cannot definitively diagnose abuse from behavioral symptoms alone. No, Doctor said quietly, I cannot. Sandra felt her heart sink. She watched as Thornton smiled, a cold, calculated expression. In fact, Doctor, isn't it true that children often display these symptoms in response to a contentious custody battle? Isn't it possible that Emma's distress is being caused by her mother's allegations and the court proceedings themselves? It's possible, yes, but… Thank you, Thornton said, turning away before Doctor could complete her sentence. Judge Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at Michael. Mister, I understand the psychological concerns, but we need more concrete evidence. Has the child been medically examined? Are there any physical findings? Michael stood. Your Honor, there was a medical examination conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell at County Hospital. The findings are in the medical records submitted as Exhibit C. The judge reviewed the document, his eyebrows rising slightly. There are some findings here, vaginal abrasion, possible, but the medical examiner notes that these could also result from normal childhood activities, rough play, or even poor hygiene practices. Sandra felt sick. Poor hygiene practices, as if she didn't bathe her daughter, didn't care for her properly. The implications stung like acid. Precisely, Thornton said, standing. Your Honor, a medical examination can be interpreted in multiple ways. Without clear, unambiguous evidence of abuse, we have only speculation. Judge Harrison rubbed his temples. What about the child's own statement? Has she been interviewed? Michael exchanged a look with Sandra. This was the crucial moment. Your Honor, the minor has been reluctant to provide detailed statements. She becomes emotionally during questioning. Reluctant or incapable? The judge asked sharply. Your Honor, that's the challenge we're facing, Michael said carefully. Emma is clearly traumatized, but her trauma is preventing her from articulating what happened to her. It's a catch-22. Her symptoms prove something happened, but her inability to speak about it leaves room for reasonable doubt. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, frustration evident on his face. So what you're telling me is that despite legitimate psychological concerns and some ambiguous medical findings, The child will not or cannot provide testimony, and therefore, I have no concrete evidence of abuse." Michael felt the ground crumbling beneath him. "Your Honor, the totality of the evidence." "The totality of the evidence is circumstantial and incomplete," Judge Harrison interrupted. "I understand your concerns and I take them seriously, but in a court of law, we require more than concern. We require facts, testimony, evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny." Thornton was smiling now, a thin, satisfied expression. "Your Honor," Sandra's victim advocate stood from the gallery, speaking out of turn. "If I may." "You may not," Judge Harrison said sharply. "This is a legal proceeding, not a town hall meeting." Sandra felt tears burning her eyes. She looked at Emma, who was now humming softly to herself, a self-soothing behavior that broke her mother's heart even more. Michael stood again, desperate now. "Your Honor, there must be another avenue, some way to help the child communicate, some way to get to the truth." Judge Harrison set down his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I'm as frustrated as you are, mister. I've been on this bench for 32 years. I know when something is wrong, but knowing and proving are two very different things in this courtroom. Unless you can find a way to get this child to communicate, truly communicate, about what happened, my options are severely limited. Supervised visitation might be all I can order, and even that is a stretch legally." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. As they recessed for lunch, Sandra pulled Emma into a private consultation room. She held her daughter, feeling the little girl's body rigid against hers, wondering if she had failed her, wondering if the system had failed her, wondering if there was any way forward at all. Michael paced outside on his phone, searching desperately through his contacts for any expert, any method, any possibility they hadn't yet explored. His career, his reputation, and most importantly, a little girl's future depended on finding an answer. And they were running out of time. Michael sat alone in his law office at 11 o'clock at night, the city lights twinkling like distant stars beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. His office was a monument to his success. Law degrees from prestigious universities framed on the walls, photos of him with satisfied clients, awards for excellence in family law. But tonight, surrounded by the trappings of his career, he felt like a failure. The Emma Martinez case file lay open before him, papers scattered across his mahogany desk like the fragments of a broken life. He'd read through the medical records again, the psychological evaluations, the interview transcripts. Everything pointed to abuse. Everything screamed that this child had suffered at the hands of her father. Yet in the eyes of the law, everything was ambiguous, deniable, interpretable in a dozen different ways. Michael rubbed his face, feeling the stubble on his chin, aware that he probably looked as exhausted as he felt. He'd been doing this for 15 years, fighting for the vulnerable, the voiceless, the broken. He'd won countless cases, helped countless people. But tonight, he felt the weight of every case he'd lost, every client he'd failed, every child who slipped through the cracks of a legal system that demanded concrete evidence of things that left no visible marks. His phone sat on the desk, mocking him. He should go home. His wife, Maria, had texted him 3 times asking when he'd be home. His daughter had a soccer game tomorrow, and he'd promised he'd be there. But he couldn't leave. Not while Emma was slipping away, not while the judge was preparing to make a decision that would send her back into the arms of her abuser. He opened his laptop and began scrolling through his contacts, years of professional connections, experts in various fields. A forensic psychologist in Denver who'd in 12 cases, a trauma specialist in San Francisco, a behavioral analyst in Boston. Everyone he called would give him the same answer. Without the child's testimony, without her words, the case was weak. Then, at 11:47 p.m., his phone rang. It was Detective James from the K-9 unit of the city police department. Michael had met him once at a conference 2 years ago, a brief handshake, an exchange of business cards that had since been lost in the shuffle of papers and time. His voice was warm but professional. I got your voicemail. You said you had a difficult case involving a child who won't testify. Michael sat up, surprised that was calling so late. Detective, thank you for getting back to me. I know it's late, but I'm just coming off a night shift, explained. My K-9, Bear, and I were working a missing persons case. I got your message while we were heading back to the station. You mentioned something about a traumatized child and a legal proceeding. Michael's heart quickened slightly. Yes, I have a client, a 3-year-old girl who's experienced significant trauma. She won't communicate about what happened, which is making it nearly impossible to prove abuse in court. The judge basically told me today that without the child's testimony, his hands are tied. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Michael could almost hear thinking. That's a tough situation, finally said. Have you ever heard of therapy dogs being used to help children testify? Michael's stomach fluttered. I haven't. No, is that a thing? It's not common, but yes, it's becoming more recognized in some jurisdictions. I've been training Bear. He's a 5-year-old German Shepherd, specifically for trauma victim support for the past 2 years. He's worked with 3 other child victims, and in each case, his presence seemed to help the child feel more secure and willing to communicate. Michael's mind was already spinning with possibilities, but he was trying to temper his hope with realism. How does it work exactly? It's straightforward in concept, though it requires judicial permission. The dog stays in the courtroom, providing a calming presence. The child can touch the dog, interact with it, which seems to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Basically, it calms their fight-or-flight response. When a traumatized child is in a calmer state, they're more capable of accessing their memory and communicating. That sounds almost too good to be true, Michael said, not hiding his skepticism. I understand your doubt, replied. It's unconventional. 2 years ago, I would have dismissed it as pseudoscience. But I've seen it work. 3 separate cases, 3 children who were previously unable to communicate suddenly able to answer questions when Bear was present. It's not a magic wand, but it creates the psychological safety these kids need. Michael glanced at the photo of Emma on his desk, her small face, her haunted eyes. What would this involve? Could you bring the dog to a courtroom hearing? Yes, if the judge approves it. I'd come with Bear, we'd get him acclimated to the space, and then during the hearing he'd remain close to the child. I have certificates, training credentials, research studies I can provide to the court. Michael felt something shift inside him, not quite hope, but a possibility opening up like a door he hadn't known was there. Detective, when would you be available? We have another hearing scheduled for next Tuesday. I can make that work, said. But I need to be honest with you. This is unconventional. The judge might reject it outright. Even if it's allowed, there's no guarantee Emma will communicate. Trauma responses are complex, but in my experience, it significantly increases the probability that she'll feel safe enough to try. After they hung up, Michael sat in silence for a long moment. He knew what people would say, that he was grasping at straws, that he was desperate, that he was willing to try anything no matter how far-fetched. They'd be right. But he was also right that conventional methods had failed. He called Sandra at midnight, knowing she probably wasn't sleeping anyway. I have an idea, he said. It's unconventional, maybe even a little crazy, but I think it might work. He explained about Detective and Bear. He heard the hesitation in Sandra's voice, the skepticism. A dog, she asked. In the courtroom. Not just any dog, Michael said. A specially trained therapy dog that helps traumatized children feel safe enough to communicate. Sandra, I know it sounds unusual, but I've talked to the officer. He has experience with this. He has credentials, research to back it up. And honestly, we're out of conventional options. Sandra was silent for a long moment. Michael could imagine her in her apartment, probably sitting in the dark, Emma asleep in the next room. If there's any chance, she finally said, her voice thick with emotion, any chance at all that this could help my daughter? Yes, We have to try. The next morning, Michael sat across from Judge Harrison in chambers. He'd prepared carefully, printing out research studies, detectives' credentials, testimonials from the previous cases where Bear had been used. Judge Harrison listened without interrupting, reading through the materials with the careful attention of someone who takes his responsibilities seriously. "This is highly irregular," the judge finally said. "I've never permitted an animal in my courtroom." "I understand, Your Honor," Michael said, "but we're in an irregular situation. We have a child who is clearly traumatized, who needs help to communicate, and conventional methods have been exhausted. Detective is offering a scientifically supported alternative that has shown promise in similar cases." The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "If I do this, and it doesn't work, I don't want any claims that the proceedings were tainted or compromised." "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Harrison put his glasses back on and looked at Michael directly. "I'm going to allow this, but I'm warning you, if this is a circus, if this is some kind of stunt, there will be consequences. Understood?" "Understood, Your Honor, thank you." As Michael left the judge's chambers, his phone buzzed with a text from Detective. "Ready to introduce you to Bear. He's a remarkable dog. Tuesday is going to change everything." Michael stood in the courthouse hallway, looking out at the city beyond the windows. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than despair. He felt a fragile, tentative possibility. But he also knew they were taking a gamble, one that could either save Emma or backfire spectacularly. There was no middle ground. Tuesday morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of autumn day that felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Sandra woke before her alarm, having barely slept. She lay in the darkness of her bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with equal parts hope and terror. Today was the day. Today, everything might change, for better or worse. She got out of bed and moved quietly to Emma's room. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully for once, her small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of undisturbed slumber. Sandra watched her for a long moment, committing the image to memory. She wanted to remember this. The before, whatever came after would be the after. "We're going to get through this, baby," she whispered, though Emma couldn't hear her. "Today, you're going to be brave, and Mommy will be right there with you." By 9 o'clock, they were in the courthouse hallway again. Michael stood nearby, wearing a charcoal suit and looking only marginally less exhausted than he had last week. He carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of a man walking into battle. "How is she?" he asked, nodding toward Emma. "Quiet," Sandra said. "I told her there was a special surprise at court today, something that might make her feel better. She asked if it was a toy." Sandra's voice cracked slightly. "I couldn't tell her it was a dog. I was afraid she'd get anxious about the anticipation." Michael checked his watch. Detective should be here any minute. He said he'd arrive about 15 minutes before the hearing to acclimate Bear to the environment. As if on cue, the courthouse doors swung open. The man who walked through was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that came from years of law enforcement work. Detective James wore his dress uniform, navy blue with gold badges catching the morning light. But it wasn't the detective who captured everyone's attention. It was the dog. Bear was magnificent. The German Shepherd was massive, probably 90 pounds of solid muscle and intelligence, with a coat of jet black fur that gleamed like polished obsidian under the harsh fluorescent courthouse lighting. His ears were alert, his dark brown eyes intelligent and aware, taking in everything around him with the kind of observant intensity that only certain dogs possessed. He walked beside the detective with perfect posture, his tail held at a neutral angle, his movements smooth and controlled. People in the hallway stopped what they were doing. A court clerk paused mid-stride. A couple of lawyers turned to stare. One elderly gentleman whispered to his companion, "That's the most beautiful dog I've ever seen." When Bear saw Emma, something shifted in his demeanor. His already alert expression became even more focused. His nostrils flared slightly, as if he was reading something in the air, in Emma's scent, some chemical signature of her emotional state that humans could never perceive. Emma, in turn, froze. She had been looking down at her shoes, her small hand gripping her mother's, her entire body tense with anxiety about what was to come. But when she sensed the presence of something large and warm beside her, she slowly lifted her head. Time seemed to stop. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the enormous dog. Her grip on her mother's hand loosened slightly. For the first time in weeks, perhaps the first time in months, her expression changed from fear and resignation to something else. Curiosity flickered across her small face. Wonder, perhaps. A tentative spark of interest in something beyond her own terror. "Emma," detective said gently, kneeling down so that he was at eye level with the 3-year-old. "This is Bear. He's a very special police dog. He's been trained to help children who are feeling scared or worried. Would it be okay if Bear stayed with you in the courtroom today?" Emma didn't speak. She rarely did with strangers, but her eyes remained fixed on the dog. Bear took a small step closer, his massive head lowering slightly. His tail, that powerful tail, gave a single, deliberate wag. "He's very gentle," detective continued. "Bear loves children, and he's very good at listening. Sometimes when people talk to Bear, they feel braver. Would you like to say hello?" Emma looked up at her mother, seeking permission. Sandra felt tears prickling at her eyes as she nodded. "It's okay, baby. You can touch him if you want to." With the uncertainty of a child who had learned to be afraid of the world, Emma extended one small hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly as they made contact with Bear's fur. The dog was warm, solid, real in a way that nothing else had been real to her in so long. His coat was soft, surprisingly soft for such a large animal. Bear remained absolutely still, allowing the little girl to explore. He didn't jump or lick or exhibit any of the exuberance that dogs often show. Instead, he was perfectly calm, perfectly patient, as if he understood that this child needed gentleness above all else. Emma's face transformed. Her rigid shoulders softened. Her shallow breathing deepened. She moved her hand slowly across Bear's neck, feeling the warmth and solidity beneath the fur. A tiny smile, barely perceptible but unmistakably real, played at the corners of her lips. Sandra felt her knees weaken. She had to grip the wall to keep herself upright. When was the last time she'd seen Emma smile? Not a forced, polite smile, but something genuine, something that suggested her daughter was actually present in the moment and not retreating into that gray place of fear where she'd been hiding. "Good girl, Emma," detective said softly. "Bear is going to stay with you in the courtroom today. Every time you feel scared or worried, you can touch Bear and he'll help you feel better. Okay?" Emma nodded, her eyes never leaving the dog's face. Michael stood watching this exchange, feeling something shift in his chest. He'd been counting on this working in theory, but seeing it in practice was something entirely different. The change in Emma was palpable, visible, undeniable. The little girl was still traumatized, still terrified of the ordeal ahead, but in this moment with this dog beside her, she seemed less alone. She seemed, for the first time in months, like she had an ally. By 9:45 a.m., they were moving into the courtroom. Detective walked with them, Bear on a soft leash, moving with the practiced precision of a dog who had been trained for exactly this situation. The bailiff looked startled but said nothing. The judge had clearly given instructions. The courtroom was filling up. The father and his lawyer were already seated at their table. Thornton's expression shifted from confident to confused when she saw the dog. She immediately stood and approached the judge's bench before the hearing even officially began. "Your Honor, I must object to this. Animal in the courtroom. It's highly irregular and potentially prejudicial to my client." Judge Harrison remained calm. "The animal is here at my permission, Ms. Thornton. It has been allowed based on established protocols for assisting traumatized witnesses. The presence of a therapy animal is not prejudicial, it is therapeutic. You will sit down." Thornton's jaw clenched, but As Sandra and Emma took their seats, Detective positioned Bear on a soft mat that had been placed near the witness box. The dog settled into a down position, his body language saying he would remain there, patient and present, for as long as he was needed. Emma was staring at the dog, and the dog was staring back at Emma, a silent communication passing between them that transcended words. Judge Harrison looked at Michael. "Whenever you're ready, counselor." Michael stood, aware that every eye in the courtroom was now fixed on him, on Emma, on the remarkable dog that had just changed the entire dynamic of the room. "Your Honor, I call Emma Martinez to testify." Emma didn't move. She continued to gaze at Bear, her small hand still resting on her lap, trembling slightly. "Your Honor," Detective said quietly, "may Emma touch Bear while she testifies. His presence will help keep her in a regulated nervous state." The judge nodded, permission granted. Emma rose slowly, her mother helping her down from the chair. She walked toward the witness stand, and as she did, she reached out and placed her small hand on Bear's massive head. The dog's tail wagged once, just once, a single, powerful acknowledgement of this bond that had formed in minutes but felt eternal. Judge Harrison swore Emma in, using an oath for children. She stood there, barely visible above the edge of the witness box, a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress, her hand on a police dog, her other hand gripping the edge of the box. The entire courtroom held its breath. Michael took a step forward, his voice gentle but clear. "Emma, can you hear me?" For a long moment there was silence. Then, in a voice so small it was almost inaudible but clear enough to be heard in the hushed courtroom, Emma whispered, "Yes." It was a beginning. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. All eyes were fixed on the small figure of Emma Martinez standing in the witness box, her tiny hand resting on Bear's massive head. The contrast was almost surreal. The enormous police dog and the fragile 3-year-old, connected by a single point of contact that seemed to anchor the child to the present moment, to safety, to something solid in her terrifying world. Michael stood carefully still, aware that any sudden movement, any loud sound, any disruption could shatter the fragile connection that had formed between the child and the dog. He'd worked with children in legal proceedings before, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. It was as if Bear was serving as a physical link between Emma's traumatized nervous system and her ability to function. "Emma," Michael said softly, his voice gentle and measured, "I want you to know that you're safe right now. You see Bear here. He's going to stay right with you while we talk. And your mommy is right over there." He gestured toward Sandra, who was gripping the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, tears already streaming down her face. Emma's gaze shifted slightly to look at her mother, then returned to Bear. Her small fingers tightened slightly in the dog's fur. "That's good, Emma," Michael continued, using the kind of soothing tone typically reserved for frightened animals. "Bear is here because he knows that sometimes talking about scary things is hard. But Bear is very brave and he's very strong, and he wants to help you be brave too." Detective stood to the side, maintaining perfect stillness. He'd worked with Bear long enough to understand that the dog was in a zone of complete focus and protection. Every instinct in the animal was directed toward this child, toward her, toward creating safety. Judge Harrison observed all of this with an expression of controlled fascination. In 32 years on the bench, he'd seen many unconventional courtroom moments, but this was something different. This was raw, primal, therapeutic, and it was working. Across the courtroom, Thornton sat with narrowed eyes, her sharp legal mind already working angles, already preparing objections. But even she seemed momentarily disarmed by the power of what she was witnessing. The father looked confused, as if he couldn't quite understand how a dog had suddenly changed the equation. "Emma," Michael said, continuing carefully, "I want to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that if you get scared, you can squeeze Bear or touch him however you need to. He likes that. He's very good at helping people feel better. Do you understand?" Emma's head moved in what might have been a nod. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow slightly. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, started to relax almost imperceptibly. "That's very good," Michael said. "Emma, can you tell me, do you like being with Bear?" It was a simple question, one designed not to elicit information, but to begin building Emma's capacity to respond verbally, to activate her communication centers. "Yes," Emma whispered, and the word hung in the air like a small miracle. Sandra made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "Good," Michael continued. "And does Bear make you feel safe?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. Her small fingers stroked the fur on Bear's neck, moving in slow, repetitive motions, a self-soothing behavior that seemed to ground her. Finally, she nodded and whispered, "Yes." The father's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I object. The child is clearly being coached. She's merely responding to leading questions in a way that benefits the opposing counsel." "Overruled," Judge Harrison said firmly. "The child is providing responses to open-ended questions. There is nothing improper here. Continue, Mr." Michael took a breath, knowing that they were at a critical juncture. Emma was responding, but she was responding to simple, non-threatening questions. He needed to carefully navigate toward more substantive questioning without triggering a shutdown. "Emma," he said, "I want to tell you something. You're being very brave right now. Do you know what brave means?" Emma shook her head. "Brave means doing something even when you're scared. And you're doing that right now. You're talking to me even though you're scared, and that makes you very brave. Do you see how Bear isn't scared? He's strong and calm, and you're being just like Bear right now." Emma looked at the dog, then looked back at Michael. For a moment, something flickered across her small face, a recognition, perhaps, of her own strength. "Emma, I want to ask you about something. Is that okay?" She nodded slowly. "When you visit your daddy, do you feel safe?" The question hung in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, touching everyone present. The father shifted in his seat. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Emma's grip on Bear's fur tightened. Her breathing became shallow again, but she didn't retreat. She remained present, her hand anchored to the dog's solid warmth. "It's okay," Michael said gently. "Bear is right here, and your mommy is right there. You're safe right now." Emma's small voice, barely audible, came again. "No." The words seemed to reverberate through the courtroom like a gong. Sandra made a sound that was pure anguish, a mother's heartbreak given voice. "No," Michael repeated, keeping his tone neutral and supportive. "Can you tell me more about that, Emma? What happens at Daddy's house that makes you not feel safe?" Emma began to tremble. Her hand on Bear's fur became almost desperate, gripping and releasing in a cycle of anxiety. But she didn't shut down. She didn't go silent. Instead, she turned her face and pressed it against Bear's neck, seeking comfort. Bear, with the wisdom of a dog trained for exactly this purpose, shifted his massive body slightly, turning to create a shelter for the child, blocking the rest of the courtroom from her view while keeping her visible enough for the legal proceedings to continue. "It's dark," Emma whispered into Bear's fur, "and loud Daddy yells, and then—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. "And then what, sweetheart?" Michael asked gently. "He touches me," Emma said, her voice so small it was almost impossible to hear. "He touches me where he shouldn't, and he says don't tell Mommy." The courtroom erupted. The father's lawyer leaped up, shouting objections. The father's face went red with either rage or panic. It was difficult to tell which. Sandra let out a cry and stood as if to rush toward her daughter, but the bailiff gently stopped her. "Order," Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Order in this courtroom. Miss Thornton, sit down now." The lawyer remained standing for a moment longer, her mouth open, before she slowly sank back into her chair. Emma had begun to cry, silent tears streaming down her face, but she remained standing in the witness box, her hand never leaving Bear's neck. The dog remained absolutely still, his body language radiating protection and unconditional presence. "Emma," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain, "you're doing so good. You're so brave. Bear is so proud of you. Do you know why?" Emma shook her head. "Because you told the truth. And telling the truth, even when it's scary, is the bravest thing anyone can do." Detective eyes glistened. Judge Harrison had set down his gavel and was staring at the child and dog, something profound shifting in his expression. "Your Honor," Michael said, "I would like a brief recess. The witness needs a moment." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Granted, 15 minutes. We'll reconvene at 10:30 a.m. As the bailiff called recess, Detective moved to Emma's side, lifting her gently from the witness box. Emma's arms wrapped around his neck, but her eyes remained fixed on Bear. The detective carried her to a private room, followed by Sandra, who embraced both her daughter and the dog in a desperate, grateful tangle of arms and fur and love. Bear remained calm through it all, his presence a constant, stabilizing force in the chaos of revelation and trauma and hope. The private room was small and windowless, more like a storage closet than a refuge, but to Emma it might as well have been a palace. She sat on Detective's lap, her small body still trembling from the exertion of speaking, of finally giving voice to the unspeakable. Bear lay across both their legs, his massive form a bridge between the child and the world that had hurt her. Sandra sat beside them, unable to let go of her daughter. She alternated between stroking Emma's hair and holding the dog, tears streaming down her face in a torrent of emotion that couldn't be stemmed or controlled. Relief, rage, vindication, and a mother's bone-deep guilt that she hadn't been able to protect her child better, all of it churned inside her like a storm. "You did amazing, Emma," Detective said softly, his own voice hoarse with emotion. "You were so brave. Bear is so proud of you." Emma didn't respond verbally. She was in that strange post-trauma space where the body has expended all its energy and the mind has retreated into itself. But her small hand moved across Bear's chest, feeling the steady thump of the dog's heartbeat, grounding herself in that rhythm. Michael sat across from them, his hands shaking slightly as he held a bottle of water. He'd been doing this for 15 years, but he'd never felt anything quite like this. The raw power of a child's simple testimony, the weight of truth finally breaking free from its prison of fear, it was overwhelming. "We need to talk about what's going to happen next," Michael said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Emma spoke her truth. She told us what happened to her. Now the other lawyer, the one working for Emma's daddy, she's going to try to ask Emma questions. Her job is going to be to suggest that maybe Emma didn't remember things correctly, or that maybe she was confused or making something up." Sandra's arm tightened around her daughter. "No, she's done enough. Emma has said what she needed to say. You can't put her through more." "I know," Michael said, and his voice was filled with genuine compassion. "And I'm going to argue that point to the judge. But Thornton has the legal right to cross-examine. What I need to know is, can Emma continue? Should Emma continue?" They all looked at the little girl. She was so small, so fragile, so utterly exhausted. And yet there was something different in her now, something that hadn't been there before. Not strength exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. A crack in the wall that trauma had built around her. "Ask her," Sandra whispered. Michael knelt down so he was at eye level with Emma. "Sweetheart, I have to ask you something very important. There's another lady and she works for your daddy. She's going to come back in the courtroom and ask you more questions. Some of those questions might make you sad or scared, but you don't have to answer if you don't want to. And Bear can stay right with you the whole time. Do you think you can do that?" Emma looked at Bear. She looked at her mother. She looked back at Michael. Then in that small voice that had already changed everything, she said, "Safe here." And there it was. Those two words. The same two words that would soon echo through the entire legal system, that would become cited in precedent cases, That would change the landscape of how child testimony was understood and protected. But in this moment, in this tiny room, they were simply a child's affirmation of safety, of trust, of her willingness to continue. "Okay," Michael said, straightening up, "let's go back in." When they returned to the courtroom at 10:30 a.m., the atmosphere had completely transformed. The energy that had been one of confident legal procedure had become something altogether different. People in the gallery were whispering. The court reporters had their fingers poised over their keyboards, aware they were recording something significant. Even the bailiffs seemed to be holding their breath. Emma took her place in the witness box again, and Bear settled onto his mat, closer than before. The dog seemed to understand that the child would need him more in the minutes to come. "Ms. Thornton," Judge Harrison said, "you may proceed with your cross-examination. However, I'm implementing special protections. If at any point I determine that the witness is experiencing undue distress or that your questioning is becoming inappropriate for a child of this age, I will halt the proceedings. Clear?" Thornton's jaw clenched, but she nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." She stood and approached the witness box, but not too closely. Even she seemed to recognize something that couldn't be transgressed, the sacred space between this child and this dog. "Emma," Thornton began, her voice adopting a pseudo-sympathetic tone that made Sandra's skin crawl, "I want to ask you some questions about what you said before. Is that okay?" Emma didn't answer, but she reached down and placed her hand on Bear's head. "You said your daddy touched you, is that right?" "Yes," Emma whispered. "And you said he touched you where he shouldn't. Can you tell me where that was?" Emma's hand clenched in Bear's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, but his tail gave a protective wag. "My private place," Emma said, so quietly that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat herself. "Your private place," Thornton repeated. "And how old were you when this happened?" 3, Emma said. 3, Thornton echoed. "Emma, do you know how old you are now?" 3, Emma repeated. "So this happened very recently, within the last few weeks or months?" Emma nodded. Thornton pressed forward. "Emma, have you ever played doctor? You know, where children look at each other's bodies." "Objection," Michael shot to his feet. "That's inappropriate and leading." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Ms. Thornton, rephrase your question or move on." Thornton tried a different approach. "Emma, sometimes children remember things that didn't really happen the way they remember them. It's not that they're lying, they just get confused. Could you have been confused about what your daddy did?" Emma's entire body went rigid. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Bear, sensing the escalation in her distress, lifted his head and pressed his massive body against the witness box, effectively creating a barrier between Emma and Thornton. "Your Honor," Detective said quietly but firmly, "the dog is indicating distress in the witness. We need to take another break." "Objection," Thornton said. "The dog is being used to influence the proceedings." "The dog is being used to protect a traumatized 3-year-old child," Judge Harrison said, his voice hard as steel. "Which is exactly what it's supposed to do. Recess. 10 minutes. As they retreated to the private room again, Emma was shaking uncontrollably. But this time, she didn't retreat into silence. Instead, she spoke. "Safe here," she said again, pressing her face against Bear's neck. But this time she added more words. Disjointed, frightened words, but words nonetheless. "Daddy said don't tell. Daddy said Mommy wouldn't believe. Daddy said it was our secret." Sandra held her daughter, listening to these fragments of truth pour out, each one a piece of the puzzle that would ultimately convict her ex-husband. When they returned to the courtroom for the final time, something had shifted fundamentally. Judge Harrison's expression had hardened into something immovable. Thornton looked shaken, as if she'd finally glimpsed the reality of what she'd been defending. "Ms. Thornton," Judge Harrison said, "do you have additional questions?" Thornton looked at the child, at the dog, at the mother holding back tears of vindication and grief. She looked at the court reporter, at the bailiffs, at the gallery full of witnesses to this moment. Finally, she shook her head. "No further questions, Your Honor," she said quietly. Judge Harrison turned to Emma, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, filled with a respect usually reserved for adult witnesses. "Emma, you have been very brave today. You told the truth, and that took courage. Thank you." Emma looked at Bear, then at her mother, then at the judge. And in that moment, the foundation of the case shifted from shaky ground to bedrock. The two words she had spoken, "safe here," had opened the floodgates, and nothing would ever be the same. Retrie the courtroom seemed different when they returned from recess. The air itself felt charged with something unprecedented, the raw truth of a child's suffering, finally given voice and witness. Emma sat in the witness box once more, her small hand resting on Bear's head, her eyes moving between her mother and the judge. The dog's presence had become more than therapeutic. It had become the conduit through which a 3-year-old could access her own narrative. Judge Harrison settled back into his chair, his expression thoughtful and grave. He'd made a decision. Whether or not Thornton had additional questions, he was going to hear more from this child. Not in a harsh, interrogative way, but in a way that would create space for the truth to continue emerging. "Emma," the judge said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised many in the courtroom, "I'm going to ask you some more questions now, but I want you to remember that Bear is right there with you. You can take as long as you need to answer, and if you need a break, you just tell me, okay?" Emma nodded slowly, her fingers finding the soft fur of Bear's ears, stroking them in that repetitive, self-soothing motion that seemed to unlock her ability to communicate. "When you're at your daddy's house," Judge Harrison began carefully, "what kinds of things happen that make you feel scared?" Emma's breathing became shallow. Bear pressed his body more firmly against the witness box, as if physically anchoring the child to the present moment. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in fragmented sentences that somehow conveyed more truth than any eloquent testimony ever could, Emma began to speak. "It's dark," she said. "Daddy closes the door. He says we're playing a special game. He says only daddies and daughters play this game. He says if I tell anybody, Mommy won't love me anymore because I'll be a bad girl." Sandra made a sound like a wounded animal. Michael placed a restraining hand on her arm. "And does he touch you during this game?" Judge Harrison asked. "Yes," Emma whispered. "He touches my pee-pee, and he makes me touch his. He says it's normal. He says every daddy does this." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath. "Does it hurt?" the judge asked. "Sometimes," Emma said, "and it feels yucky, and I don't like it. And I tell him I don't like it, but he says I have to be quiet and still and not tell anybody." Michael felt his throat constrict. Next to him, he could hear Sandra's breathing become ragged, could feel the mother's rage and grief and protective fury radiating off her like heat. "Emma," Judge Harrison continued, "how many times has this happened?" Emma looked confused by the question. She held up her fingers trying to count but gave up after a few attempts. "Lots of times," she finally said. "Lots and lots. Every time you visit your daddy." "Most times," Emma said. "Sometimes other people are there and he doesn't do it, but most times he does it." Thornton had gone pale. The father was now staring at the table in front of him, his face a mask of controlled fury or panic. It was difficult to tell which. "Thank you for telling me this, Emma," Judge Harrison said. "You've been very brave. I want to ask you one more thing. When you're with Bear, do you feel scared?" Emma looked at the dog, then back at the judge. She reached down and wrapped her arms around Bear's massive neck, pressing her face into his fur. "Safe here," she said, repeating those two words that had already become the emotional cornerstone of this case. "Bear makes me safe. Bear doesn't hurt me. Bear is nice." Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked up again, There was something different in his expression, a clarity, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "I think we need to call Doctor back to the stand," he said to Michael. "And I want the medical examiner present as well. This testimony has provided context that changes everything." Over the next hour, as Emma remained in the courtroom with Bear, the judge refusing to remove her, recognizing that any separation from the dog might cause further trauma, the prosecution presented their expert witnesses again. But this time, the experts' findings took on an entirely different meaning. Doctor was recalled. "Your Honor, now that I have context, now that I understand specifically what the child is describing, the behavioral markers she's been exhibiting make complete sense. The nightmares, the regression, the fear of separation from her mother, the resistance to physical touch, these are all consistent with childhood sexual abuse. The fact that she was previously unable to articulate what happened doesn't make the abuse less real. It makes it more real, because children who are abused often dissociate or repress the trauma as a survival mechanism." The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was also recalled. "Your Honor, when I examined Emma 3 months ago, I noted the physical findings but couldn't definitively link them to abuse. However, now that I understand the specific behaviors the child is describing, those physical findings take on new significance. The abrasion, these are consistent with the type of abuse Emma is describing." Thornton attempted cross-examination, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. She was defending the indefensible, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Her questions became perfunctory, almost mechanical. She was going through the motions of legal procedure while the ground had already shifted beneath her feet. By mid-afternoon, Judge Harrison called for another recess. He wanted to speak with Michael and Thornton in his chambers. "I've made my determination," he said without preamble. "Based on the testimony of the minor, the corroborating evidence from the psychological and medical experts, and the totality of the circumstances, I find that there is substantial and credible evidence that the minor has been subjected to sexual abuse by her father. This is not a close call. This is not a matter of reasonable doubt. This is a clear case of child sexual abuse." Thornton closed her eyes. "Your Honor." "I'm issuing an immediate protective order," Judge Harrison continued. "No unsupervised contact between the father and the minor. I'm recommending criminal charges be filed. I'm also recommending that the minor receive trauma-informed therapy with a specialist in childhood sexual abuse. And I'm going to be making a formal commendation to the police department regarding the use of the therapy dog. That dog broke through barriers that conventional legal procedure could not penetrate." When they returned to the courtroom for the final ruling, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The father looked defeated, his lawyer exhausted. Sandra sat with her arm around Emma, and the little girl had Bear's leash in her small hand, the dog never leaving her side. Judge Harrison's formal ruling was delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. Full custody to Sandra. All unsupervised visitation terminated immediately. Criminal investigation to be initiated. Mandatory counseling for the child and the perpetrator if charges didn't preclude it. But the most significant moment came when Judge Harrison turned to Emma directly. "Young lady, I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. Your daddy did something wrong. And because you were very brave today, because you told the truth, we can make sure you stay safe. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her fingers still tangled in Bear's fur. "That dog there," Judge Harrison continued, gesturing to Bear, "that dog knew you needed help, and he helped you find your voice. That's a very special dog. You should be proud of Bear, and you should be proud of yourself." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in something that transcended typical courtroom decorum, a collective release of tension, a recognition that justice, real justice, had finally been served. Some people applauded before catching themselves and stopping. Others wept openly. Detective stood with tears streaming down his face, one hand on Bear's shoulder. The dog had done what months of legal maneuvering had failed to do. He had given a traumatized child the safety to speak her truth. Sandra held her daughter and cried, tears of vindication, of rage at what her child had endured, of profound gratitude for this remarkable dog and this detective who had believed that there was another way. Emma, exhausted but present, looked up at Bear and whispered, "Thank you, Bear. You made me brave." And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon against trauma isn't eloquent legal arguments or expert testimony. Sometimes it's unconditional love, patient presence, and the quiet strength of a dog who knew exactly what a frightened child needed. 3 weeks later, the autumn sun painted the courthouse steps in shades of gold and amber. The decision had been delivered, the protective orders signed, the criminal investigation formally initiated. Martinez had been arrested 2 days after the hearing and charged with aggravated child sexual abuse. His lawyer was preparing a defense, but everyone knew it was futile. The testimony of a 3-year-old girl, corroborated by medical evidence and psychological evaluation, was virtually unassailable. Sandra stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, holding Emma's hand, watching as Detective James approached with Bear on his leash. The dog moved with that same dignified calm he displayed throughout the trial, but his entire demeanor brightened when he saw Emma. "Hey, Emma," Detective said warmly. "Look who wanted to come see you today." Emma's face transformed in a way that would have been unimaginable 3 weeks ago. She let go of her mother's hand and rushed toward the dog, throwing her small arms around Bear's neck. The dog lowered himself slightly, allowing the child to embrace him fully, his tail wagging with a joy that was almost palpable. "Bear," Emma cried out, "you came." "Bear asked if we could visit," Detective said, kneeling down beside them. "He said he wanted to make sure you were doing okay, that you were safe." Sandra felt tears spring to her eyes, not the tears of desperation and fear that had characterized the past 6 months, but tears of gratitude and hope. She watched her daughter interact with the dog, and it was like watching a flower beginning to bloom again after a long winter. "How is she doing?" Detective asked, standing and moving to speak with Sandra while Emma continued to pet and hug Bear. "Better," Sandra said, her voice thick with emotion. "The therapist we found, she specializes in trauma in young children, says Emma is processing everything remarkably well. She still has nightmares sometimes, but they're becoming less frequent. And she's talking more, really talking, using full sentences, asking questions, being curious about the world again." Detective nodded. "That's wonderful. It takes time, but children are resilient. With proper support, Emma will heal." "I don't know how to thank you," Sandra said. "If it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for Bear, the judge would have dismissed the case. My daughter's abuser would have had continued access to her. I don't even want to think about what might have happened." "You don't need to thank me," Detective said. "Bear was just doing what he was trained to do. He sensed a child in distress and provided comfort. That's what these dogs are for, though I'll admit, I've never seen a case quite like this one. Emma's testimony is being cited in legal circles now. There are judges and lawyers reaching out, asking about therapy dogs in testimony. You and Bear might have just changed the way the legal system handles child abuse cases." Sandra looked at her daughter, still embracing the massive dog, and felt something settle in her chest. A peace that had been absent for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Over the following weeks, Emma's transformation continued in subtle but significant ways. She began attending a new one recommended by her therapist, where she slowly started to engage with other children again. She still preferred quiet activities, drawing, reading books with her mother, playing with stuffed animals, but the withdrawn, zombie-like state had lifted. More importantly, Emma had begun to talk about her experiences, not in the fragmented, frightened way she had in the courtroom, but in the halting, processing way of a child working through trauma with professional support. Her therapist, doctor, reported remarkable progress. "Emma is beginning to understand that what happened was not her fault," doctor told Sandra during one of their parent conferences. She's still processing the betrayal, that a parent, someone who was supposed to protect her, hurt her instead. But with consistent support, with the knowledge that she's safe now, with the love and validation you're providing, she's healing. Will she be okay? Sandra asked, the question that haunted every moment of her waking life. Children are incredibly resilient, doctor said. Will she remember what happened? Possibly, though early trauma memories can be fragmented. Will it affect her? Yes, but with proper therapeutic intervention, the impact can be minimized. The fact that she was able to disclose, that she was believed, that she received justice, these things matter enormously in her healing trajectory. 1 month after the hearing, detective called Sandra with news. I wanted you to know that the media attention around this case has been significant. Several news outlets are running stories about Bear and about how therapy dogs can help child witnesses. There's even talk of legislation being proposed to make it easier to use certified therapy dogs in courtroom proceedings. That's incredible, Sandra said. I hope it helps other children. It will, detective assured her. Emma's case is becoming a landmark. Lawyers are already citing it in motions. And more importantly, other police departments are reaching out, wanting to start their own K-9 therapy programs. Your daughter's courage is going to have ripple effects far beyond what you might imagine. 2 months after the hearing, on a gray November afternoon, Sandra received a letter from Judge Harrison. It was handwritten, a rarity in this age of digital communication. Ms. Martinez, it read, I wanted to take a moment to reach out to you personally. In my 32 years on the bench, I have witnessed countless cases, many of them heartbreaking. But I have rarely witnessed the kind of raw courage and honesty that your daughter displayed in my courtroom. Emma's willingness to speak her truth, despite her trauma and her fear, allowed justice to be served in a way that purely legal arguments never could have achieved. I want you to know that I have recommended to the state bar that consideration be given to expanding the use of certified therapy animals in legal proceedings involving child witnesses. Your daughter may have changed the system. I am grateful for her bravery, and I hope she continues to heal and grow into the strong woman I suspect she will become. Sandra read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the weight of what had transpired. That same week, detective called again with an unexpected proposal. I'm starting a foundation, he said, an organization dedicated to training therapy dogs specifically for legal and medical settings where traumatized children need support. I want to call it the Emma Fund, after your daughter, with her permission and yours, of course. Would that be something you'd consider? Sandra felt overwhelmed. That's incredible, yes, absolutely yes. On a cold December afternoon, 3 months after the hearing, Sandra and Emma attended the official launch of the Emma Fund. The event was held at the police department's K-9 training facility, and it brought together lawyers, judges, psychologists, and other professionals interested in the intersection of animal therapy and justice. Detective stood at a podium, Bear at his side, and told Emma's story to an auditorium full of people. He spoke about the moment Emma's fear began to crack, about the 2 words that changed everything: safe here. When he finished, he called Emma and Sandra to the stage. Emma held back, shy in the presence of so many strangers, but when she saw Bear's tail wagging with recognition, she ran forward and embraced the dog. The auditorium erupted in applause. That night, as Sandra tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked a question that would have been unimaginable months ago. Mommy, can we see Bear again soon? I think we can arrange that, Sandra said, smoothing her daughter's dark curls away from her forehead. Bear would like that, and I think you like Bear too. I love Bear, Emma said simply. Bear saved me. Yes, Sandra whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. Bear did save you, but you saved yourself too, baby. You found your voice. You were brave. You told the truth. That was all you. And Bear helped, Emma added, already drifting toward sleep. Yes, Sandra agreed. Bear helped. In the darkness of her daughter's bedroom, Sandra allowed herself to cry, not tears of desperation anymore, but tears of gratitude, of hope, of the knowledge that justice had been served and that her daughter would heal. The legal battle was over. The long road to recovery stretched ahead, but it was a road that Emma would travel with love, support, and the memory of a remarkable dog who had given her the courage to speak. Months later, when Emma was older, when the trauma had become something she carried rather than something that consumed her, she would understand the significance of what had happened. She would learn that her case had inspired legislation, that therapy dogs were now being used in courtrooms across the country, that her willingness to speak had protected countless other children. But for now, in this moment, Emma was simply a little girl who was safe, who was loved, who was healing. And somewhere in the city, in a police station's K9 unit, a remarkable German shepherd named Bear rested peacefully, knowing that he had done exactly what he was meant to do. He had given a frightened child the safety to find her voice, and in doing so, he had changed not just one life, but the lives of countless others yet to come. The two words safe here would echo through courtrooms and legal journals, through training programs and law schools. They would become a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of a child's courage, and the extraordinary bond between a human and a dog that transcended words and spoke directly to the soul. Justice, it turned out, didn't always require eloquent legal arguments or expert testimony. Sometimes, it simply required someone, or in this case, something, to help a frightened child feel safe enough to speak the truth. And that was everything. The end.